The wind howled across the Montana plains that morning, carrying with it a sharp chill that signaled the lingering grip of winter. Snow clung stubbornly to the higher ridges, while icy mud coated the lower pastures. The land was wild, vast, and indifferent, a place where survival depended on instinct, timing, and a little luck. Jake Williams was used to the silence. A seasoned ranch hand with a sun-worn face and a quiet demeanor, he lived alone in a remote cabin nestled between two forested hills. His only companions were his three dogs: Rex, a stoic German shepherd; Buddy, a gentle golden retriever with soulful eyes; and Scout, a high-strung border collie always in search of a job to do. Together they had carved out a rhythm of work, solitude, and unspoken loyalty. That morning, as Jake saddled up for a routine check of the northern boundary fence, a faint sound reached his ears, high, desperate, and completely out of place. A whinny, thin and trembling, echoing across the open valley. He followed the sound. What he found broke something open in him. Lying beside a still, lifeless mare was a newborn foal, no more than a few hours old. Its golden coat was still damp, with birth fluids, its legs trembling as it tried to rise, only to collapse again. The mare's eyes were closed, her body cold. A difficult birth, most likely, in the wrong weather, in the wrong place. And now, the foal was alone. Jake didn't hesitate. He wrapped the fragile colt in his coat, cradled it against his chest, and carried it to his truck. The dogs greeted him at the cabin with wagging tails and sniffing noses. But their curiosity turned to quiet focus as Jake laid the foal on a thick bed of straw in the barn and began preparing a formula bottle. What happened next caught Jake completely off guard. Rex stepped forward first, licking the foal's damp forehead the way he would a newborn pup. Buddy nestled beside the shivering colt, radiating warmth. Scout, ever alert, kept watch by the barn door, ears twitching with every sound. The foal blinked slowly and nuzzled into Buddy's fur. Jake watched, stunned, as his dogs instinctively welcomed the orphan into their pack. He named the foal Comet, for the white star-shaped marking on his forehead. In the days that followed, Comet didn't just accept the dog's companionship. He began to imitate them. He tried to bark when Rex barked. He stood in line with the dogs at feeding time. At night, he curled up in the straw, legs tucked beneath him, nestled tightly between Buddy and Scout. Jake had brought home a horse, but what he had really created was something entirely new. Comet's early days at the ranch unfolded, not like those of a typical young horse, but more like the formative days of a puppy raised in a tight-knit canine family. From the moment he was strong enough to stand without wobbling, he began mimicking his new siblings, Rex, Buddy, and Scout, not just in their movements, but in their mannerisms, their play, and even their sounds. When Rex barked at a passing coyote, Comet would lift his head and try to join in. The result wasn't quite a bark, nor a whinny. It was a bizarre, nasal sound that startled the chickens and made Jake double over with laughter. The dogs seemed to accept it. They looked at him, tails wagging as if to say, "Good try, kid." Feeding. Time became a spectacle all its own. Jake had set up a routine. The dogs each had their bowls, and Comet had a special bottle. But the young colt insisted on queuing up like the others. He'd trot to the feeding area and wait patiently, sometimes even nosing Buddy's bowl as if to say, "Mine's next." When Jake approached with the bottle, Comet would lift his head high and wag his short, fuzzy tail, a gesture that always earned him a gentle pat and a quiet chuckle. Playtime was where Comet truly flourished. With his long legs and growing strength, he quickly became the fastest member of the pack, but he never outgrew his desire to fit in. When Jake threw tennis balls across the pasture, the dogs would bolt after them, and Comet would join the chase, his hooves pounding the earth in powerful strides. He'd attempt to grab the balls in his mouth, often failing but never giving up. Eventually, he learned to nudge them with his nose and kick them back with his front hooves. Jake, watching from the porch, would sip his coffee and marvel. The strangest moment came one rainy afternoon when thunder rolled through the valley. As always, the dogs crowded into their shared doghouse, small, snug, and definitely not built for equine guests. But that didn't stop Comet. He tried to squeeze in, first, with his head, then his shoulders. His legs stuck out awkwardly, and his rump remained fully exposed, but he seemed content. Inside the cramped space, Rex rested his head on Comet's neck, while Buddy licked the colt's nose. Scout stood outside, drenched but alert, as if standing guard over a very weird but beloved family unit. Over the next few weeks, Jake began documenting what he saw, not because he thought anyone would believe it, but because it felt too important to forget. The way Comet scratched behind his ear with his hind leg, just like the dog's. The way he attempted to lift his front leg when marking fence posts, comically uncoordinated but determined. The way he'd mimic Scout's herding behavior, circling the chickens with a serious expression, ears forward, tail twitching. Dr. Sarah Chen, the local vet and longtime friend of Jake's, stopped by for a routine checkup and was immediately captivated. "He doesn't know he's a horse," she murmured, watching Comet chase Buddy with a stick in his mouth. Jake nodded. "He thinks he's a dog." Dr. Chen began regular visits, documenting the case. "It's species imprinting," she explained. "He bonded with the dogs in his most critical developmental window. His brain patterned them as his model species. His sense of identity is tied to theirs." Jake leaned on the fence, watching. "Comet lie down with Buddy in the shade of the barn." "Is that in bad?" Sarah smiled. "It's not bad, it's just different." By the time Comet was 3 months old, he was no longer the tiny foal who could barely stand. He was growing, fast. His legs had lengthened, his chest broadened, and he now towered over his siblings. But none of that seemed to matter. He still trotted after them wherever they went, copied their posture, and followed their lead. When a delivery truck approached the ranch, the dogs barked and ran to the gate, and so did Comet. His deep bark neigh echoed across the yard, startling the driver. So badly he dropped his clipboard. But once he recovered, the man laughed and began bringing dog biscuits just for Comet. By now, the community had begun to take notice. Jake's ranch became an informal attraction. Children came to visit the dog horse, often bringing treats or toys. Comet adored the attention and performed with surprising precision. He could sit on his haunches, stay on command, come when called, and even do a variation of roll over, lying on his back and kicking his legs like Scout did in the Tall Grass. Sarah's notes became more detailed. "He recognizes Rex as alpha," she observed during one visit. "He waits for cues, he respects hierarchy. He's not just mimicking behavior, he's participating in pack structure." Jake found himself marveling at the intelligence, the adaptability, and the deep affection between species. It was, in every way, a family, and Comet wasn't just part of it. He was thriving in it. Jake had always known the day would come. No matter how seamlessly Comet had blended into his canine family, the young Mustang was still a horse. His legs were longer, his muscles denser, and his instincts, though buried under layers of dog mimicry, were starting to emerge. The signs were subtle at first. A certain alertness when the wind carried scents from far-off pastures, a deeper, more resonant neigh that surfaced now and then during early morning fog. Still, Jake avoided the inevitable, until the wild herd came, down from the ridge. It was late summer when they appeared, 12 Mustangs lean and wary, led by a powerful bay stallion with flaring nostrils and a scar across his chest. They moved like shadows across the ridge, cautious but purposeful, grazing near the fence line at the far edge of Jake's property. Jake stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, heart pounding. Comet was outside with the dogs, sniffing along the trail when he caught the scent. His head lifted sharply, ears pivoting toward the ridge. For a moment he froze. Then instinct kicked in, but not the one anyone expected. Rex barked at the unfamiliar presence, and Comet barked too, or tried. Cue the bark neigh, that strange hybrid sound erupted from his throat. Then he galloped with the dogs toward the fence, hooves churning dust head high, tail flagging in the wind. The wild horses froze. The bay stallion lifted his head, muscles taut, eyes locked on the spectacle racing toward him. A horse that sounded like a dog, flanked by actual dogs. Jake grabbed his binoculars and stepped outside. Comet skidded to a halt near the fence, lowered his front half into a dog-like playbow, and began bouncing from side to side, ears forward, tail attempting to wag. The wild horses watched, unmoving, clearly baffled by the behavior. Then the stallion stepped forward. He moved with deliberate grace, stopping just shy of the fence. He released a soft nicker, a greeting in horse language. A test. Comet's head tilted. He turned to Rex and whined. The German shepherd stepped forward, placing himself between Comet and the approaching horses, emitting a low growl. Buddy and Scout joined, forming a defensive line. Comet's confusion was written across every muscle in his body. The stallion tried again. This time a gentle huff, ears relaxed, eyes curious. But Comet, unsure, reverted to what he knew. He grabbed a nearby stick, trotted toward the fence, and dropped it in front of the stallion. Then play bowed again, inviting a game of tug. The wild stallion stared, then snorted and stepped back, clearly mystified. A young filly approached next, her gait tentative but open. She stretched her neck to sniff Comet's face. Classic equine introduction. Comet sniffed back, at her rear. The mare squealed in offense and lashed out with her front hoof, missing Comet by inches. The young Mustang bolted, galloping back behind. Rex pressing against the shepherd's side like a frightened pup. Jake rushed to the edge of the pasture, heart pounding. "Easy, boy," he whispered. Dr. Sarah Chen, who Jake had invited that morning for this very possibility, took notes rapidly from her position near the barn. "He's never learned the language of his own species," she said softly. "He's dog socialized. These are strangers to him." The standoff continued for another few minutes. The wild horses tried again, offering sniffs, flicks of the ears, soft whinnies. But Comet responded with confused barks, head tilts, and canine invitation signals. Eventually, the bay stallion gave a dismissive snort and turned away, leading his herd back over the ridge. Comet stood watching them disappear, his chest heaving, his stick still lying near the fence. That night, he didn't sleep in his usual pile with the dogs. He lay alone, staring at the stars through the open barn door, tail still and ears flicking at every distant sound. The encounter had stirred something in him. Not rejection, something deeper. A question. Who am I? In the days that followed, Jake noticed a change. Comet would wander to the fence line alone, standing for hours, staring toward the ridge. Sometimes he'd practice sounds, trying to mimic the whinnies he'd heard. Other times he'd try walking like the stallion had, lifting his legs in exaggerated, awkward steps. But when the dogs came running, he'd instantly switch back, bounding after them, stick in mouth, tail swishing in that signature not quite wag. He was caught between two worlds. Dr. Chen visited again, concern etched into her features. "We need to be careful," she told Jake. "He's not just an animal with cute habits anymore. He's a young horse with a fractured sense of identity. This could become dangerous for him and for others if we don't help him find some kind of balance." Jake nodded, heart heavy. He had raised Comet like a dog, but maybe it was time to help him grow into something more. Comet's world had always been simple. The pack was everything, and he was part of it. He didn't question why he looked different, why his body didn't work quite like the others, or why he couldn't curl into the doghouse without leaving most of himself outside. He was one of them, loyal, playful, protective. That was enough. But after the encounter with the wild Mustangs, cracks began to form in his identity. For the first time, Comet began doing things in secret. Jake noticed it first in the early mornings. When the valley was still wrapped in fog, Comet would rise before the dogs, head to the edge of the field and stand alone. There, he'd practice. Not dog behavior, horse behavior. He'd try lifting his tail and issuing high-pitched whinnies, mimicking the sounds he'd heard from the stallion. He'd attempt to trot with the fluid, floating steps he'd seen the young filly use. His movements were awkward at first, too bouncy, too dog-like, but he was trying. Yet every time Scout came bounding into view, or Buddy barked from the porch, Comet would snap back. He'd gallop over, tail swishing erratically, and return to the only identity he knew how to inhabit, the oversized four-hooved dog. But Jake saw it all. "He's testing," Dr. Chen said on her next visit. "Trying to reconcile two internal realities, one learned, one instinctive." It all came to a head one afternoon when Comet attempted to leap from a small rock outcropping. It was something he'd watched Scout do countless times. Spring from the high ridge to the soft grass below, nimble and quick. But Comet wasn't Scout. His body wasn't made for that kind of landing. The moment his hooves hit the ground, his front leg buckled sideways with a sharp crack. Jake's heart stopped. By nightfall, Dr. Chen had wrapped the sprain and prescribed a week of rest. "He'll be okay," she said, gently stroking the young Mustang's nose. But this was his wake-up call. He's not a dog, and that confusion could get him seriously hurt. Jake sat by Comet's stall that evening, Buddy resting his head on his lap, Scout curled at his feet. Comet lay on a bed of straw, ears drooped, eyes dark and unsure. "You've got the heart of a dog," Jake whispered, "but you were born something else, and maybe that's okay." He knew something had to change. Pushing Comet into horse society wouldn't work. His pack was his foundation. But denying his nature, his size, his strength, his instincts, would only bring more pain. That's when Dr. Chen suggested gentle Ben. Ben was a retired quarter horse with a long history of therapy work. He'd helped traumatized animals and children alike. Calm, wise, and patient, Ben was known throughout the region as a natural healer. "If anyone can help Comet bridge the gap," Sarah said, "it's Ben." Ben arrived the following week in a livestock trailer, stepping down with a grace that belied his years. He was larger than Comet, broader, with a soft gray coat and deep, gentle eyes. Jake and Sarah orchestrated the meeting carefully. Comet, still, limping slightly from his injury, approached hesitantly. As expected, he offered a dog-like greeting, head low, sniffing, tail twitching side to side. But Ben didn't flinch. He stood still, then lowered his head slowly in a classic equine hello, gently brushing his muzzle along Comet's shoulder. Comet flinched, then stepped closer. The next hour was a quiet ballet. Comet attempted play bows. Ben responded with grazing movements. Comet circled him with short, jerky hops. Ben simply turned his body and stood near. No judgment, no rejection, just presence. Over the next days, something incredible happened. Ben didn't demand that Comet change. He modeled. When Comet brought him a stick, expecting a game of tug, Ben lipped it gently, then dropped it. When Comet barked neighed for attention, Ben answered with a soft nicker. When Comet rolled in the grass like Scout, Ben joined him, lowering himself and rolling side to side, not as a dog would, but with the slow rhythm of a horse relaxing in safety. And Comet began to mirror back. He started nibbling Ben's withers, a horse greeting he'd never done before. He began walking in parallel, heads aligned, steps matching. He even allowed Sarah to place a training halter on him without resisting, something he'd always struggled with before. But the real breakthrough came one morning at feeding time. Jake stood with 2 buckets, one for Ben, one for Comet. Before, Comet would have barked for his bottle or waited alongside the dogs. This time he lifted his head and let out a whinny, clear, high, proud. Ben nickered in approval. The dogs looked up from their food, Rex now graying around. The muzzle let out a soft bark of what Jake could only describe as pride. Comet stood taller. Something had shifted. He wasn't losing who he was becoming more. By autumn, the air over Montana turned crisp and electric. Golden leaves rustled across the ranch, and the dogs grew friskier with each cool sunrise. Comet had changed, subtly but unmistakably. He still played fetch, still barked neighed at visitors, and still nuzzled into Scout's flank on chilly nights. But his steps had gained grace. His vocalizations, once confusing garbles, now alternated effortlessly between whinnies and dog-like barks. His body, once awkward in either world, now moved with the fluid adaptability of someone who had found peace in his duality. Comet wasn't just a horse raised by dogs anymore. He was something new. Word of his transformation spread. Sarah had published an article in a regional veterinary journal about his social adaptation and identity integration. Phrases that made Jake chuckle but captured something real. People were fascinated by the idea that Comet wasn't confused by his mixed identity. He was enriched by it. Then came the call from the Wild Horse Sanctuary in Wyoming. They had a problem. 12 orphaned foals, recently rescued after a herd was illegally broken apart. The foals had rejected surrogate mares and wouldn't interact with each other. They were fearful, withdrawn, and wouldn't eat unless hand-fed. The sanctuary director had seen videos of Comet online. "We think he might help," she said. Jake hesitated. Comet was family. Could he really send him away? But Dr. Chen framed it differently. "You wouldn't be sending him away, Jake. You'd be giving him a mission, and Comet was born to serve." So they prepared for the trip. Ben would go to act as a calming presence. The dogs, of course, would ride behind in Jake's truck. Comet refused to board the trailer until he could see them out the window. So Jake rigged a mirror so Comet could check in on his reflection, believing it was his pack nearby. The journey was long, but uneventful, until the trailer pulled into the sanctuary and 12 frightened foals stared at the new arrival. Comet neighed gently, trotting forward with his head low. He didn't approach like a dominant stallion. He didn't prance or posture. He dropped to the ground and rolled onto his back, legs flailing gently in the air, just like Scout. The foals froze. Then, one by one, curiosity won out. A smaller filly took a step forward, sniffed Comet's outstretched hoof, and nickered softly. Comet responded with a play bow and nudged a rubber ball toward her. She tapped it back. The staff watched in stunned silence as Comet began a session that would become legend, leading a game of tag, breaking up tension with dog-like play, and offering gentle horse-to-horse grooming in moments of nervousness. Over the next week, Comet transformed the herd. They began eating together, sleeping near each other, allowing human contact. He had bridged a world that no trainer, vet, or behaviorist could. Dr. Ellen Martinez, the sanctuary vet, coined a term for it: species empathy. "Comet isn't just teaching horses how to be horses," she said. "He's teaching them how to trust, because he understands what it means to feel different." But as the weeks turned into months, something shifted. Comet played less fetch. He stopped barking at the mail truck. He still nuzzled Buddy and Scout during Jake's visits, but the intensity had faded. His focus was elsewhere now, on the foals, on the herd. Jake felt it in his bones. Comet was drifting. Then Rex fell ill. Jake made the call. The sanctuary arranged immediate transport. Comet returned home in a blur of hooves and emotion. He bolted from the trailer, whinnied once for Ben, then unleashed a full bark neigh for his pack. Rex, weak but alive, lifted his head. Comet trotted to his side, dropped to the ground, and lay there without moving, his muzzle pressed gently against the German shepherd's chest. He didn't leave his spot for 2 days. He didn't need to. When Rex passed quietly beneath the oak tree, Comet made a sound Jake would never forget, a deep, trembling mix of whimper and wail, foreign to both species. It was the sound of losing a father, a teacher, a guide. The next morning, Comet rose before dawn and began patrolling the fence line, alone. Rex's job, but now, his. That's when Jake knew the decision had been made. Comet wasn't leaving again, but the work, the healing, could come to them. With Dr. Chen's guidance and the sanctuary's partnership, they built a facility on the ranch, the Cross Species Healing Ranch. The first guests were 3 traumatized foals and 2 retired therapy. Horses. Comet led their sessions. Sometimes he'd greet them with a bow, sometimes with a nuzzle, sometimes with a stick. Whatever they needed, he gave. He had become the bridge, not between horses and dogs anymore, between pain and peace. The sun was low over the Montana hills, painting the sky with streaks of amber and rose. Jake stood at the edge of the pasture, coffee in hand, watching the most unusual herd he had ever known. Comet trotted beside a young filly, tossing a tennis ball gently between his teeth before dropping it at her hooves. Buddy barked from the porch, tail wagging, while Scout rested nearby, his aging frame stretched across the warm wood. This, Jake thought, was a family, not defined by species, not defined by rules, but forged through something more powerful: love, trust, and the courage to remain different. Comet had once been the orphaned foal who didn't belong anywhere. Too horse to be a dog, too dog to be a horse, but now he belonged everywhere. His hybrid identity had become a gift, not a burden. He led sessions with traumatized foals, helped veterans with PTSD find calm again, and even worked with nonverbal children, using his mixed cues to reach places therapy had never touched. His bark neigh had become a kind of anthem. The sound of resilience, of defying definition. Jake watched as a new colt recently arrived from a neglect case approached Comet cautiously. The colt flinched when Comet extended his neck, but instead of pressing forward, Comet sat just like Rex used to. Ears soft, posture loose, no pressure, just presence. The colt blinked, then stepped forward. And for Jake, that was the miracle. Not just that Comet had healed, but that he had chosen to stay open, to share his weird, wonderful self, to teach others that it was okay to be both things, or neither, or something else entirely. Comet turned, as if sensing Jake's thoughts. He gave a soft whinny, then a single joyous bark. His tail twitched, in that imperfect wag that made Jake smile every time. He trotted over, dropped a stick at Jake's feet. Jake crouched beside him, stroking his muzzle. "You've come a long way, boy." Comet nudged him gently. Behind them, the ranch stirred with life. Dogs and foals, horses and people, all woven into something unexplainable and yet entirely real. And somewhere beyond the hills, Jake knew there were more waiting, more animals, more people, more stories. And Comet would be ready because in a world that tries to divide us by difference, he had become the proof that hearts don't recognize boundaries. They only know love. One herd, one heart. And Comet, part dog, part horse, all miracle, was its beating center. Stay tuned. The next chapter of Comet's journey is coming soon.